When Chris Evans and Sandra Bullock walk onto the stage of the Victoria Lange show, the audience expects a heartwarming reunion, two beloved Hollywood icons reflecting on their legendary careers. But Victoria Lange isn't here for nostalgia. She wants drama. She wants confrontation. She wants the truth that no one dares to ask for. As the lights dim and the applause fades, Chris and Sandra take their seats, smiling, unaware of the storm brewing before them. Victoria grips her cue cards, her eyes glinting with something more than journalistic curiosity. This isn't going to be a friendly conversation. What starts as a standard Hollywood interview will soon unravel into something much bigger. A battle of words, emotions, and raw honesty. But as Victoria prepares to challenge them, to push them into uncomfortable corners, she doesn't realize she's the one about to lose control. Because before the night is over, Chris and Sandra will say something that will change everything, and no one in that audience will ever forget it. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The studio was vibrant. Strategic lighting illuminated the set, enhancing the warm tones of the environment. The audience, packed with fans and curious spectators, murmured in anticipation, some holding signs, others simply fixated on the grand red curtain that concealed the stage. The ambient sound was filled with the excited chatter of the crowd and the soft echo of the production team's precise movements, like gears in a well-oiled machine. At the center of the stage, a sleek black leather armchair sat in a dominant position, the seat of the host. Beside it, two modern design chairs waited for the evening's special guests, Chris Evans and Sandra Bullock. The massive screen in the background displayed the show's name in bold, vibrant letters. Everything in the studio was perfectly orchestrated, a symphony of colors, lights, and sound, setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Backstage, Chris and Sandra were moments away from stepping out. The two exchanged hushed words, a quiet reassurance between longtime friends who shared an unspoken understanding. Chris, dressed simply in a black suit over a dark t-shirt, maintained his signature composed demeanor. His presence was magnetic, a perfect balance of humility and quiet intensity. Sandra, on the other hand, wore an elegant navy blue dress. At her expressive eyes, she smiled, though there was a subtle tension in the air. "It's going to be fine," Sandra murmured, adjusting the hem of her dress. Chris raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "You think so?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper. They both knew this wouldn't be an ordinary interview. The host was known for her confrontational style, sometimes ruthless. She didn't shy away from uncomfortable questions, and her enjoyment in deconstructing her guests had become a signature of the show. On the other side of the stage, the woman who would be conducting the interview gripped her cue cards firmly. Her gaze was sharp, piercing. Dressed in an impeccably tailored beige suit, she exuded confidence. Her name was Victoria Lange, a seasoned journalist, polarizing and fearless. She was a master at pushing her guests to their limits. Her show wasn't about comfort. It was about revelations, tension, and breakdowns. As the show's theme music played, the audience erupted into applause. The game had begun. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Victoria spread her arms wide, an effortlessly charming smile on her lips. "Tonight we have a very special evening ahead. Two stars, two Hollywood legends, reunited in what promises to be an unforgettable conversation." The crowd roared with enthusiasm. Some held up signs reading, "Speed was my childhood," or "Chris, marry me." The excitement was real. Without further ado, please welcome our guests, Chris Evans and Sandra Bullock. The red curtain parted, and the two walked onto the stage, both smiling and waving at the crowd. Chris gave his classic subtle nod, a silent gesture of gratitude. Sandra, ever radiant, blew kisses to the audience. The studio vibrated with cheers, the energy palpable. They took their seats, still smiling, as Victoria watched them keenly. She observed every detail, the way Chris maintained his relaxed posture, the way Sandra casually tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Small gestures, subtle signals, tools she could use later. The applause gradually faded, replaced by an expectant silence. Victoria held her cue cards, a slight smirk playing on her lips. She cast a calculated glance at both of them, like a predator studying its prey. "Welcome to the show." Her voice was smooth, but there was an underlying energy to it, as if every word was chosen with surgical precision. "Thanks for having us, Victoria," Sandra said, crossing her legs with effortless grace. "It's great to be here," Chris added, his tone calm. Victoria tilted her head slightly, maintaining her smile. Well, I think we can all agree it's fantastic to see you two together again. After all, decades of careers, successes, challenges, and of course a few controversies. She paused, letting the words linger. There was something in the way she said controversies that hinted this interview would not just be about nostalgia. The audience responded with a mix of nervous laughter and intrigued whispers. They could sense something brewing. Sandra and Chris exchanged a quick glance, just for a second, but Victoria caught it. But before we get into all of that, she continued, casually flipping through her cue cards, I'd like to start with something simple. She lifted her eyes, fixing them on both of them. What does it mean to be Chris Evans and Sandra Bullock today? Chris gave a faint smile, leaning forward slightly. The question seemed innocent, but the intent behind it was clear. This was the beginning of a psychological game. Sandra took a deep breath, preparing to respond. But as she formulated her words, Victoria clutched her cue cards, just a little tighter, her gaze sharp with unspoken intent. The audience, still unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, cheered enthusiastically. The question still hung in the air. What does it mean to be Chris Evans and Sandra Bullock today? Sandra took a deep breath. It wasn't a difficult question, but something about the way Victoria had framed it suggested there was more beneath the surface. The real game hadn't even begun yet. Chris, ever composed, glanced at the audience briefly before answering. I think it means continuing to be authentic in a world where that can be a challenge. Sandra nodded, adding, and it also means recognizing the journey. We've grown, changed and learned, but at our core, we're still the same people who started out all those years ago. The audience applauded. It was a diplomatic, but sincere answer. However, Victoria just smiled a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She flipped through her cue cards, almost theatrically. Interesting. She paused, pretending to consider their responses. The silence stretched just a little longer than necessary. Then came the first blow. But did you really have control over your careers? Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with something that resembled mischief. Or were you just puppets of Hollywood taking whatever roles you were given without actually having a choice? The studio fell silent. No more murmurs. The question wasn't just provocative. It was a direct attack. Sandra blinked, slightly surprised but quickly concealed. Chris, on the other hand, remained completely still, simply observing Victoria as if assessing an opponent in a chess match. The host didn't hesitate. She pressed harder. Let's take you, Chris, for example. You were one of the biggest action stars of the... Then you disappeared for a while, and only resurfaced with John Wick. Was that your choice or just luck? What happened in between? Chris didn't answer immediately. He knew that one wrong move could shift the entire dynamic of the interview. I think like anyone, I went through phase. His voice was calm, measured. Not everything in life follows a perfect script. Some choices we make, others are opportunities that come our way, and we decide whether to take them or not. Victoria wasn't satisfied. So, in other words, sometimes you accepted roles you didn't really want. Sandra chuckled softly, but there was an underlying note of caution in her laughter. That happens to every actor. The perfect project doesn't always appear at the right moment, but every role teaches you something. Victoria narrowed her eyes. So, Sandra, you've taken roles you hated. The audience murmured. The aggressiveness of the question was impossible to ignore. Sandra kept her smile, but her gaze turned slightly sharper. I've taken roles that, looking back, I might not do again, but hate. No, everything I've done has brought me here. It's part of the journey. Victoria didn't back down. That sounds like a rehearsed answer. The studio fell into an even deeper silence. Chris leaned forward slightly. His posture was still relaxed, but there was a subtle shift in his energy. What exactly were you expecting as an answer, Victoria? The question caught the host off guard. It was the first time someone had challenged her so directly that night. She blinked but quickly recovered, flashing another smile. Just a little more honesty, Chris. He smiled too, but his gaze remained steady. Honesty doesn't need to be dramatic to be true. A murmur spread through the audience. Chris had just turned the tables, at least for now. Victoria, however, was not one to accept defeat easily. She pulled out a new card, and this time her expression changed. All right, if we're talking about honesty, let's really dive into it. She turned to Sandra, her eyes gleaming with renewed interest. Many say you could have been the greatest actress of your generation, but instead you chose safe romantic comedies and comfortable roles. Do you regret not taking bigger risks? The question was a precise strike. It didn't just challenge Sandra's career, it implied that she had never been good enough to be taken seriously. Sandra blinked quickly, and Chris looked at her almost imperceptibly. It was a crucial moment. She took a deep breath, holding the tension for just a second. That's interesting, because I never saw my career that way. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You didn't? Sandra smiled again, this time with unexpected ease. People think taking risks always means choosing dark, intense roles, but I chose to make movies that brought joy to millions of people. Isn't that a risk? Creating something pure without cynicism. You think that's safe? I think it's one of the biggest risks an artist can take. The audience started applauding. It was a graceful yet powerful response. Victoria, however, was unfazed. She picked up another card, and her expression shifted again. This time, Chris was the target. And you, Chris? Her voice dropped slightly, as if preparing to ask something more personal. Have you ever regretted something you accepted, or something you turned down? Sandra instinctively turned toward him. Chris, however, didn't answer immediately. There was something in the way Victoria framed the question that suggested she knew something. He took a slow breath. Every choice I've made has led me to this moment. The response seemed simple, but the weight in the air said otherwise. Victoria looked directly at him, holding his gaze for a long moment. Even the choices that made you lose something important. The audience fell completely silent. Now, the attack was direct. Sandra furrowed her brow. Victoria knew exactly what she was doing, and Chris knew exactly where this was going. He took a deep breath, preparing to respond. But were they truly ready for what was coming next? The question hung in the air like a sharpened blade. Even the choices that made you lose something important. The audience held their breath. This time, it wasn't just a provocative remark. It was something deeply personal. Chris Evans remained still, his deep, enigmatic eyes locked onto Victoria Lang's. For a moment, the entire studio seemed to bow to the silence. Sandra Bullock glanced at Chris, tension visible in her posture. She knew this was dangerous territory, and Victoria knew exactly what she was stepping into. Chris took a deep breath. Life isn't just about professional choices, Victoria. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that was almost tangible. Sometimes the decisions we make, or the ones we are forced to make, shape who we are, but that doesn't mean we regret them. Victoria tilted her head, pretending to reflect on his words. So, you've never had regret? Chris paused, his jaw tightening slightly. I would only regret not living out of fear of what could have been. The audience, which had been in complete silence, erupted into applause, but Victoria wasn't ready to back down. She picked up another card, and her demeanor shifted. Chris, your life has been marked by public tragedies. You've lost important people, faced difficult times, and yet you always appear serene. The public sees you as untouchable, almost a modern-day monk. Sandra immediately recognized that Victoria was trying to force him into a moment of televised vulnerability, a moment of weakness for the cameras. Chris clasped his hands over his knees. He didn't blink. Pain is part of the human experience. Sandra felt a chill. She knew Chris rarely spoke about his personal life. I'm no different from anyone else, he continued. We all experience loss. What matters is not the pain itself, but what we do with it. The raw honesty in his response made even Victoria hesitate for a second, but only for a second. And you, Sandra? Victoria abruptly turned to her. You've had your own challenges. You've talked about love in so many films, yet in real life, you never found someone to truly stay by your side. Why? Sandra didn't move. The audience murmured. The question was cruel, and everyone knew. Chris discreetly looked at her as if offering silent support. Sandra blinked a few times. Then she let out a soft laugh, but it was different. Low, filled with something Victoria hadn't expected. You know, Victoria, she began, her voice soft but firm. There are questions that reveal more about the person asking them than about the one answering. Victoria blinked, surprised. She hadn't seen this coming, but Sandra wasn't finished. I did find someone. The studio fell into absolute silence. Sandra rarely spoke about her private life. Someone who loved me exactly as I am, who made me laugh, who shared his life with me, who gave me a family, and he's gone. The tension in the studio was palpable. Victoria realized her mistake too late. Brian Randall wasn't just my partner, he was my. And just because someone isn't physically here anymore, doesn't mean the love disappears. The audience was completely still. Even Victoria didn't know how to respond. Chris looked at Sandra and with an almost imperceptible gesture, placed his hand over hers. It was a silent but powerful moment. No,
Words were needed. After a few seconds, Sandra took a deep breath, regaining her composure. I have lived love, and it's still with me. Does that answer your question? The audience erupted into applause. Victoria, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. She glanced down at her cue cards, realizing that for the first time that night, she had lost control of the interview. Sandra and Chris weren't just defending themselves, they were turning the tables, and Victoria knew it. She swallowed hard. She picked up her last card. If she had any chance left to regain control, she needed to use it now. She lifted her eyes, this time without smiling. Chris, there's something you've never spoken about in public, something that could change the way everyone here sees you. Chris said nothing.
He just waited. Are you ready to finally reveal the truth? The studio fell into complete silence. Sandra shifted slightly in her chair, as if sensing something was wrong. The game wasn't over yet, and Victoria was about to play her final card. The studio was frozen in silence. Chris, there's something you've never spoken about in public, something that could change the way everyone here sees you. The weight of Victoria's words settled over the audience like a thick fog. This wasn't just a difficult question. It was a calculated strike. Sandra Bullock subtly shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering toward Chris. She didn't know what was coming next, but she could feel the tension thickening. Chris, however, remained still. His face betrayed no emotion. Are you ready to finally reveal the truth? Victoria pressed, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who knew they had a powerful card to play. The audience was silent, waiting, expecting something monumental. Chris let a slow breath escape through his nose. Then at last he spoke. What truth are you referring to, Victoria? It was a simple question, but one that shifted the power back into his hands. Now she had to be the one to reveal her move. Victoria hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then she looked down at her cards, as if considering her next words carefully. For decades, people have admired your resilience, your kindness, your ability to remain humble in an industry that devours people. But many also wonder, how much of Chris Evans is a persona, a carefully constructed image of a man who never loses his temper, who never makes mistakes, who is always the good guy. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the personal bombshell they were expecting, but it was just as pointed. Sandra narrowed her eyes. She understood what Victoria was trying to do now. This wasn't about exposing a scandal. It was about dismantling Chris's identity. Chris tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a forced smile, not a nervous one. A genuine, quiet, almost amused smile. I see. Victoria arched an eyebrow. So, what's your answer, Chris? He exhaled, leaning back slightly in his chair. If I were playing a character, Victoria, I think I'd be doing a terrible job of. Because the truth is, I'm just a guy who makes mistakes, a guy who has regrets, a guy who has moments of anger, sadness, frustration, just like anyone else. The audience remained still, absorbing his words. The difference is, I've never felt the need to broadcast those moments to prove I'm human. Sandra felt something swell in her chest, a mix of pride and admiration. Chris turned slightly toward the audience now. I'm not immune to life, Victoria. No one. But I choose what parts of myself I share with the world. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because some things don't need to be public to be real. A wave of applause surged through the audience. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine respect. Victoria tapped her cue cards against the desk, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had lost this round. Sandra, sensing an opening, decided it was time to push back. She turned toward Victoria, crossing one leg over the other. Let me ask you something, Victoria. The host blinked. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. You've built a career on getting people to reveal things they don't want to. You thrive on tension, on pushing buttons. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself why? The audience let out a collective gasp. Victoria Lang had never been on the receiving end of her own tactics. For the first time that night, she looked uncomfortable. That's not what this is about, Sandra. Sandra tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. Isn't it? Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. Chris, still calm, decided to drive the final nail in. People don't remember us for the roles we play in movies, Victoria. They remember us for the role we play in their lives. Silence. Then thunderous applause. Victoria exhaled, her fingers tightening slightly around her cue cards. She had lost. Completely. Sandra turned to Chris, grinning. That was fun. Chris chuckled softly. You have an interesting definition of fun. Victoria, regaining some of her composure, forced a smile. Well, this has certainly been a revealing conversation. She turned to the cameras, signaling the end of the segment. Chris Evans, Sandra Bullock, two legends still standing, still inspiring. And as we've seen tonight, still full of surprises. The audience erupted into another standing ovation. As the cameras cut, Victoria turned back to Chris and Sandra. For the first time there was something different in her eyes. Respect. Maybe even a little bit of admiration. I have to admit, she said softly, I didn't expect you two to handle things the way you did. Sandra Neither did you apparently. Victoria let out a breath, almost a laugh. Touch A. Chris simply nodded, standing up and extending his hand. Victoria hesitated for only a moment before shaking it. No hard feelings? She asked. Chris's lips curved into a knowing smile. No expectation. And with that he and Sandra walked off the stage, leaving behind not just an interview, but a statement. A statement that some things don't need to be said to be understood. The interview was over, but Chris and Sandra weren't in a hurry to leave. They sat in the dressing room, unwinding from the intensity of the conversation. Sandra kicked off her heels, sighing. Well, that was fun. Chris smirked. You have an interesting definition of fun. She laughed, then glanced at him. I meant what I said, you know, about us being family. Chris nodded. Yeah, I know. Sandra smiled. It's weird, right? How we've known each other forever but never actually worked together again after Speed. Except for the lake house. Chris shrugged. Timing is funny like that. Sandra chuckled. Or maybe you were just avoiding me. Chris smirked. I think you were avoiding me. She laughed, shaking her head. You know, back then I had the biggest crush on you. Chris blinked. Really? Sandra grinned. Yeah, but you never made a move. Chris tilted his head. Did you want me to? She thought about it for a second, then smiled. Nah, I think we were always meant to be what we are. Something better than that. Chris nodded. Yeah, we were. A comfortable silence settled between them. Sandra sighed. I'm glad you were there today. Chris met her gaze. Always. Sandra hesitated. You get it, don't you? Loss, grief, moving forward. Chris exhaled. Yeah, I do. Sandra reached for his hand, giving it a quick squeeze. Thanks for that. Chris just nodded. Then with a grin she sat up. Okay, enough of this serious talk. Let's do something crazy. Chris smirked. Like what? Sandra tapped her chin. Let's open a bar. Chris laughed. A bar? Yeah, we'll call it the Speed Stop. All drinks come with countdowns. Stressful but fun. Chris chuckled. Sounds like a terrible idea. Sandra grinned. Exactly. That's why we have to do it. Chris shook his head, smiling. You always know how to make things lighter. Sandra nudged him playfully. That's what best friends do, right? Chris's expression softened. Yeah, that's what best friends do. She stretched her arms. Okay, enough of this. I'm starving. Burgers? Chris smirked. Burgers? Sandra hooked her arm through his as they walked toward the exit. No cameras, no spotlight, just two friends still standing, still connected, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The studio was silent. The interview had taken an unexpected turn, but Victoria Lang had one last question to ask. She leaned forward, her expression sharp. Hollywood is always changing. New faces, new stories. The industry moves fast. Do you ever worry that you're being left behind? The audience tensed. It was a ruthless question. Chris and Sandra exchanged a glance. Neither looked shaken. Sandra smirked first. Oh, Victoria, you make it sound like we're dinosaurs. The audience chuckled, but Victoria didn't back down. I'm serious. Careers in Hollywood don't last forever. Do you fear becoming irrelevant? Chris leaned forward slightly. No. Victoria blinked. She hadn't expected such a direct answer. Chris continued. Relevance isn't about being in the spotlight. It's about the impact you leave behind. People don't remember actors just for their films. They remember how those films made them feel. Sandra nodded. Hollywood is obsessed with newness, but audiences, they care about connection, and connection doesn't have an expiration date. Victoria studied them,
realizing they weren't shaken by the question at all. So you're saying you don't fear being forgotten? Chris smiled faintly. Everyone gets forgotten eventually. Victoria, that's life, Sandra added, her voice softer but firm. But if we've told stories that mattered to someone, if we've made people feel something, then we were never irrelevant to begin with. The audience erupted into applause. Victoria exhaled, setting down her cue cards. She wasn't just impressed, she was changed. She turned to the cameras for the final line of the segment. Chris Evans, Sandra Bullock. Maybe Hollywood moves on, but some legacies never fade. As the applause continued, Chris and Sandra exchanged a small smile. They had never needed validation to know their worth, and they never would. The interview was over, but its weight still lingered. Chris and Sandra sat in the quiet dressing room, lost in Sandra finally broke the silence. That was something. Chris smirked. Yeah? You okay? She nodded. You? Chris exhaled. I am. A moment passed before Sandra spoke again. Do you ever think about it? Think about what? Chris asked. Legacy. What we leave behind. Chris was quiet for a second, then nodded. Yeah? Sometimes. Sandra sighed. Do you think it's enough? Chris's gaze softened. More than enough. Sandra studied him. How do you know? Chris smiled. Because people don't remember what you did. They remember how you made them feel. Sandra nodded, then smirked. So what's next? Chris chuckled. Dinner. Sandra laughed. I meant in life, dummy. Chris shrugged. More stories. More moments. The rest doesn't matter as much. Sandra smiled. Yeah, that's enough. They stood, arms linked, walking into the night. No cameras, no spotlight, just two friends, living. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.